Hey guys, Chris here. Tonight we have a story about a couple that goes on a fly fishing vacation to wild Wyoming, and there they discover that there's something in the wilderness more dangerous than gray wolves and grizzly bears. That's next. All right, you guys, I found a really cool pond right behind me here on my GPS on my way in. I went and checked it out, and this is what we found. Really cool. Big granite wall on the other side, and beautiful night in the Sierra. Springtime, I love it. Great time of year. And speaking of great, I have a Schilling hard cider, classic semi-sweet, local legend. Check that out. It's got a Sasquatch on it carrying a boombox. I'm not sure what he's listening to. Probably Born to be Wild. Wild thing. Something like that. I always got pine cones in my cup there, but let's check that out. It looks like an amber ale almost. Look at that. And this came to me from one of our younger viewers. His name is Ben. He and his mother went and picked this out for me, and I met them, and Ben is 4 years old. He's gonna be 5, and he watches my show, and him and his family live in Plumas County, Northern California, and they're gonna be taking a trip to Willow Creek where the Patterson-Gimlin footage from 1967 was filmed of Patty, the Sasquatch, so that's pretty cool. But all right, thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching too. Ooh, a pine needle. That's really tasty. It tastes just like cider, except it's got some alcohol content to it. That is very tasty. It's semi-sweet. It says it's nothing artificial, and apparently it's endorsed by Bigfoot. So, cheers. So our story starts in Michigan, and that's where Rick and Kathy were living. Married couple, been married about 15 years. They loved Michigan, and they loved fishing. And they had recently, a few years earlier, picked up fly fishing. Turns out they really loved that. And what they would do is every summer, they would plan a big week-long trip to a fly fishing destination out west somewhere. The previous year, they went to Yellowstone National Park. I used to work there. And they fished there, and they loved it, and they did the whole park thing for the whole week, enjoyed that, and then they thought, next year, why don't we come back and go just outside the park into one of these wilderness areas. In this vast wilderness up there in northwest Wyoming, what's interesting about Yellowstone is that you have the national park, northwest Wyoming. It actually borders into Montana and a little bit into Idaho, and around Yellowstone you have several national forests, and within those national forests you have wilderness areas, and then just south of Yellowstone is Grand Teton National Park. It's called the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, just this vast area. So their plan was to go into the SHOSHONE National Forest, which is 2.5 million acres, wild country, and then go into the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, 198,000 acres in the north end of the Wind River Range. And the Fitzpatrick Wilderness is named after the mountain man Thomas Fitzpatrick, who in the 1830s, along with Jim Bridger, went into the Wind River Range and explored there. Just this beautiful, vast country of granite peaks, 13,000 foot Gannett Peak, highest point in Wyoming is there, 13,820, I believe, and several 12,000-foot peaks, just this amazing country, and then go into one of these valleys and fly fish. Their plan was to get a guide, and they knew it was important to have somebody that knew what they were doing, so they hired a man named Joseph, and Joseph lived in the area. He was of Native American heritage. He was an Arapaho. His family had lived in Wyoming for several generations, and he had a guide service, and so they went through him and made their plans for this fly fishing trip. So this country, the Wind River Range, as well as the Yellowstone ecosystem, very wild and remote. It's some of the most remote country in the lower 48 of the United States. And so you need to be prepared out there, because there's mountain lions, black bears, bobcats, gray wolves, and grizzly bears. The king of the forest is the grizzly bears out there. And so Rick and Kathy each had Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum handguns they were going to carry on their hip. Just have it at all times while they're fly fishing, while they're hiking, backpacking, whatever they're doing, they're going to have it. As well as Joseph had a .338 Winchester Magnum rifle that he brought along. So they flew into Wyoming, went to Cody, worked their way over, met Joseph in a small town, made their final plans, final questions, and then they all drove together to the trailhead, and they were going to go into Dinwiddie Creek and follow that into this drainage, the Dinwiddie Creek drainage, and do their fly fishing. They were really excited. They start out in their backpacking. They got all their stuff. They got their guns, their food. They're going to be out for 5 nights. Joseph had everything worked out. He knew where they were going to camp each night, what food they were going to have, and he just knew how to handle the situations that could come up out there. And they're heading down the trail, and they're heading toward this place called Big Meadow. Big, vast meadow with steep mountains on either side, winding creek in the middle, little stands of trees around it, and this was their place to spend their first night. Joseph already had a spot planned out for them just inside this tree line, close enough to the creek where they could walk out and do some fly fishing right away. They set up their camp, got everything set up, and they were good to go. So the first day, they got up early, got some breakfast going. We're all excited, no wind, sun was coming through the trees. They head out into the meadows, they start scoping it out. Joseph was with them, he's kind of showing them, different bugs and showing them the water, trying to help them ease into this and understand what they're going to catch. Catching some rainbow trout, and I believe there's brown trout up there as well. First day they started catching fish, having a great time. They actually saw a large bull moose on the other side of the meadow. They thought that was really cool. The next morning, same thing. They got up, went out fishing. Joseph's assisting them. And this time they saw a grizzly bear. And this was after Joseph spotted it with the binoculars, and it was pretty far out in the meadow, but they saw this grizzly bear just meandering right through the middle of the valley in this 2-foot tall grass, and they were just awed by this thing, how big it was and how beautiful it looked in the light. And they didn't feel it was a threat. It was pretty far away, but it was a reminder that they were really happy that Joseph was there, he was guiding them, and he was keeping an eye on things. And his job wasn't to go fly fishing with them, it was to assist them, show them where the fish are, help them with their flies and their leaders, occasionally land the fish if they needed that, and then to keep an eye on things like grizzly bears. So he would sit back up on a rock or off into the trees, and he would watch the meadow with his binoculars and watch for things like grizzly bears. So Rick and Kathy were getting into a routine. They would wake up early, have breakfast, and then head out with their fly fishing gear and fish in the meadow. Come back somewhere around midday, have lunch, relax, take a nap, and then head back out later in the afternoon, early evening. one of these afternoons they were out, and they both had their backs to the meadow. They were on the opposite side of the stream, and they were very focused on fishing the stream in front of them. Joseph was off in the tree line, off to the right here, sitting on a large rock, scanning the meadow. And they're fishing, and all of a sudden he says, "There, over there. Do you see it?" And he pointed across the meadow to this large rock outcrop, this beige-colored rock outcrop, maybe about 200 feet high, and then the mountains behind it were just towering, and then this green meadow below it. And they both looked, and he says, "There, it's a hairy man." And it didn't register right away, and they're looking and they're trying to see, and then they see this shape, this large upright, almost silhouette, walking in front of this beige-colored rock. And they could clearly see it was forward-leaning posture, and these large arms swinging like a pendulum as it was just marching right through this meadow. Maybe 200, 250 yards out there, pretty far out there, but they could clearly see it. And they were just in awe watching this thing. They watched it for about a minute in the light, walking by this rock, and it was heading for the trees. And then after about a minute, it disappeared into the trees. It was gone. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, we just saw a Bigfoot." And initially, when he said hairy man, it took them a moment to understand what he was saying, and they went, "Oh, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, oh my gosh." And they were so excited. They kept talking about it that afternoon and into the evening about what they'd seen that day on their trip. Really amazing. So Rick and Kathy were really excited to talk about this and learn more. And so that night around the campfire, they were talking with Joseph about their experience and trying to learn more about Bigfoot. Joseph, who was a Arapaho heritage, mentioned that his family and people in his nation will hand down stories through the generations of stories about Sasquatch and the different names that they call them. Wood apes, ape man, hairy man of the woods, the hairy man, the keeper of the forest. The word Sasquatch literally means hairy man. In fact, the Ojibwe people refer to him as Sabe, which means Sasquatch. And each nation has their own name for Sasquatch and Bigfoot. Joseph went on to talk about Native Americans throughout the centuries had been depicting Bigfoot and Sasquatch in their artwork, in stone sculptures of heads, totems of the tribes on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and ceremonial masks where the masks look pretty frightening, and they're depicting a Sasquatch in these masks. And many of them have these round mouths, which shows that they were whistling or doing whoop sounds. And you guys have heard many of my stories where there's whoop sounds from the Sasquatch in the story. The loud whoop, whoop, that kind of a sound. He also mentioned that some nations believe that they can actually cloak themselves and become invisible and even travel through different dimensions. Really very paranormal stuff. And so they're not just a mammal that we can never find. It's just really wild stuff. Joseph said that he and his people respect them. They're mostly peaceful, but you need to use caution. They have been known to be associated with unexplained disappearances throughout the generations, and also attacks on people and even tribes. And when he was saying this, Rick could sense this tone of concern and caution in his voice. And he also noticed that he was preparing and cleaning his gun while he was sitting around the campfire having this discussion. Thought it was a good day. We're really happy they went on this trip, and it brought a whole new dimension to their experience by knowing what they know now. Decided to call it a night, and they went to bed. So the next morning they got up, had their breakfast, and this day it was time to break down camp, pack everything up, and start heading deeper into the wilderness. They were going to catch the Glacier Trail and head towards Downs Fork Meadow, is what they call it. This beautiful area that they had to get to. Now to get there, they had to go through the meadow where they saw the Sasquatch, and had to go right near there and then go into the trees. And they had a whole different feel now, knowing what they now know. So as they're heading into this forest, it became very dark in there. Trees flanked them on either side, and the path became curvier. It was still following this stream, but now it's in this forest. A very quiet, calm stream just flowing through there. And there was cliffs on either side, and it almost felt like they could be ambushed in there or something. It was getting dark, and these cliffs, and they couldn't see around them, and they just had this feeling they were like in a, almost like a prison or something, because it was midday, but it was very dark in there. They kept going, feeling kind of creeped out, and then finally they could see some light coming up, and then they could see the green grass, and they entered into this Downs Fork Meadow, just this beautiful area. They hiked through into the interior of it, and this creek came in, and other tributaries came in and joined it in this area, and all these streams are coming together, creating this paradise for fly fishing. Towering mountains around it, and they were really excited. They dropped their packs, got their camp set up. Joseph had a spot picked out, and they started fly fishing. So Rick and Kathy are fishing in this meadow, having a good time. Day's starting to pass by, and the sun in these narrow valleys, as you know, once it gets behind the peak, it gets dark on the valley floor really quickly. It's not dark out, but it gets dark in the valley. And they're fishing, and suddenly they hear the loudest howl roar that you could imagine. Just this prolonged roar for 10, 15 seconds. Just stopped them in their tracks. And they're listening to this, and they couldn't pinpoint where it came from and where it was emanating from. It was just echoing all around them. But they knew it was close. They knew it was somewhere right there. Almost like it was directed at them. Rick unholsters his .44 Smith & Wesson, pulls it out. Kathy does the same. Joseph has his Winchester in hand, and they're listening. They don't hear anything. They're looking around. Everything felt normal, except they just heard this horrific sound. And this went on for 15 minutes while they're just listening to see what the next move was going to be. And then Joseph says, and he doesn't whisper, he says, "The hairy man is here." And they look at each other, and then they come together and they have a discussion about what are we going to do? We got to figure this out. We can't camp here tonight. This doesn't feel right. So they packed up their gear and they tried to move out of the area. They had a couple hours of daylight, but like I said, the sun was coming in at such an angle that it was dark in that valley. They're maneuvering their way through, back out the way they came to get to the previous meadow and just camp somewhere in the middle of the valley that meadow so they could see all the way around and just feel more comfortable. As they're traveling, going back into this forest, Kathy looked over to her right and she saw in the forest, maybe 200 feet away, she saw that shape paralleling them going through the forest. She didn't hear anything and she said, there, I see him. Rick and Joseph both stopped and they looked, they couldn't see him, but they believed her. But it looked like this Sasquatch was following them, or at least escorting them out. They knew there was no time to hang around, have food, take a break. They kept moving and they had guns out and they felt like they were almost like in the jungle, just navigating carefully about what's next and about what's going to happen. Finally, as the sun's going down, they reach the previous meadow and they go out in the middle of it and they make their camp. And now they can see completely around them before the sun goes down. Joseph gets a campfire going and then they huddle in for the night. Kathy was really spooked by the whole day, the whole experience. Rick, as well, was really concerned. They were really happy. Joseph was there. They had their guns. They're in the middle of this meadow. They're all together. And then Joseph said, it's okay. You guys can go and rest. Go in your tents, get some rest, get some sleep. I'll watch things. It'll be okay. Rick, Kathy went into their tents, got some sleep. And a few hours later, 2-3 hours later, Rick wakes up and he can hear the campfire going. See the glow of it through his tent. He gets up, unzips his tent, and he can see Joseph standing at the edge of camp with his rifle, just kind of holding it in his arms. He walks up behind Joseph. He says, how are things? And Joseph just said, all clear, all quiet. Rick's looking around, he's looking up at the stars, and then Joseph spoke. He said, the Navajo people call him Biki Nitsa. And he said, many nations believe that when there's an encounter or an occurrence, that it's a message or a warning. And the warning is telling man to change his ways. And that's all he said. Rick was listening, kind of agreeing with it. I was like, that's interesting. Looking up at the night sky, thinking about things. And he said, you know, I think everything's going to be okay. I think everything's going to be just fine. And then Joseph turned and looked at him. He nodded his head. We're going to be okay. Rick turned, went back to his tent. Then Rick said, can I watch for a little while? And Joseph said, nope, I got it. You get some more rest. He went in his tent, fell asleep. Next morning, they got up. Joseph said that he had gone to bed at some point that night. They packed up their stuff, worked their way back down to the trailhead. No issues, no other problems, no other sightings, nothing. They didn't hear anything else. Rick and Kathy got back to Michigan and they knew they had a very memorable trip. They stayed in contact with Joseph over the years, and Joseph continued for years after to work as an outfitter guide in the Wind River Range. And whenever they did talk on the phone, they all knew that there was something out there in the wilderness of Wyoming. And that is our story for tonight, and I am out of the hard cider here. That is a done deal. I got my little lantern to keep me cozy here, and the sun is dropping really quick. It's almost 8:30, so I better, oh, that looks pretty scary. Should I do a story like that? That's kind of scary. All right, You guys want to walk out with me? Let's do it. We're going to hike out right now, and we're going to work our way towards that large rock face over there. Frogs, I was recording the frogs, just a couple of them, and they went for about 12-15 seconds, and then they just stopped. So I was like, okay, as I always say, time to keep hiking. All right, you guys, thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys, and as always, if you guys have your own stories, send them to basecampchris2@gmail.com. I'll take a look at it. If you guys like the stories that I do, strange, unexplained, and things that go croak in the night, you guys know what to do. So there's my car. We'll see you next time. Keep hiking.